Hello again readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf. So previously we talked about the first decade of the Victorian era, from 1837 to 1846, and now I'm just carrying straight on. I am dividing them into two different videos, but I am just carrying straight on for myself into the second decade from 1847 to 1856. So last time we looked at some art, we looked at some books, we looked at some poetry and some key events from year to year, and I tied it back to what I am reading for Victober, and now I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but progressing chronologically forward to the second decade. I read less from this decade because I am still working on Oliver Twist, but it's still interesting to trace the developments as they continue, and I did read some little bits and pieces. 1847 was a pretty good year both for literature and for progress. Previously we talked about the Poor Laws and the very stringent workhouse conditions endured by Oliver Twist. Well, in 1847, an act was introduced to prohibit the separation of elderly couples in the workhouse, something that really reminds me of some of the talk that we've had recently about couples being separated as they go into residential care homes. The factory day was shortened further to a mere 10.5 hours. As somebody who works 10.5 hour shifts and I only have to do like 3 to 4 a week, that is a long day. Thanks in part to the work of campaigners like Richard Ostler, the factory king, whose visits to factories led to him comparing child labour to slavery, something that was still being practiced in the United States and there was much opposition to in Britain. By this time there were 4,000 miles of telegraph lines in Britain, and James Younger Simpson was using chloroform as an anaesthetic, so we can really see progress starting to emerge in various areas. William Dyce was beginning a series of frescoes in the Houses of Parliament depicting scenes from Arthurian legends, which were becoming increasingly popular thanks to people such as Alfred Lord Tennyson, who would turn them into modern poems like The Lady of Shalott in 1832. It took William Dyce many years to complete these works, which is why I'm not showing them to you yet. Like the Victorian MPs, you're going to have to wait and see. One work of art that was completed in 1847 was this giant painting by Irish artist Daniel Maclise, which can now be found, if you should have any desire to look at it again, in Leeds Art Gallery. Staying in Leeds, Armley Jail was built to look like some kind of Gothic castle, because reduced uses of execution and transportation was leading to a need for more prison space. These new prisons were supposedly aimed more towards reform, enforcing haircuts, routines, hard labour and religion to try to change a criminal's lifestyle. In the literary sphere, Charles Dickens continued to be immensely popular, with Dombey and Sons currently in serialisation. He came to Leeds in 1847, and Leeds City Museum has a selection of Dickens paraphernalia, including an album collecting together the illustrations from all his published works. If I remember rightly, this was a way for people to get illustrations that perhaps they didn't have because not all of his editions were published in Britain the first time round with the illustrations. Also in serialisation at the time was Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. That was one Victorian novel that I didn't particularly enjoy when I read it quite a while ago now. This was the year that William Wordsworth finally gave up on revising the Prelude following the death of his daughter, although it wasn't published until after his death in 1850. My selected poems doesn't include the entire poem, which is seen as his masterpiece and exists in multiple versions starting in 1799 when he first wrote it. But I did really enjoy the extracts from Book 1 that are presented here. If Wordsworth had been less compulsive about the rewriting of it, the Prelude would have stood alongside the Excursion and the Recluse to form some kind of great philosophical poem to rival Paradise Lost. So what we see in the Prelude is Wordsworth reaching back into his childhood and using incidents there to build up this idea of him as being somehow connected to nature in a way that qualified him to fulfill this objective. While I think that the bits of the 1799 version that I know are perhaps slightly fresher, the final Prelude is a wonderful romantic poem in the sense of the romantic movement, and it's impressive how effectively he is able to persuade us that his childish antics like stealing boats and snaring woodcocks are somehow powerfully significant. I wanted to read for you, if you don't mind, a page-long extract where he basically gets dizzy while out ice skating, and it becomes this kind of revelation to him. I'm reading from line 433. All shod with steel, we hissed along the polished ice in games confederate, imitative of the chase and woodland pleasures, the resounding horn, the pack loud chiming, and the hunted hare. So through the darkness and the cold we flew, and not a voice was idle. With the din smitten, the precipices rang aloud, the leafless trees in every ice crag tinkled like iron, while far distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy, not unnoticed. While the stars eastward were sparkling clear, and in the west the orange sky of evening died away. Not seldom from the uproar I retired into a silent bay, or sportively glanced sideways, leaving the tumultuous throng to cut across the reflex of a star that fled, and flying still before me, gleamed upon the glassy plain, and oftentimes, when we had given our bodies to the wind, and all the shadowy banks on either side came sweeping through the darkness, spinning still the rapid line of motion, then at once have I, reclining back upon my heels, stopped short. Yet the solitary cliffs wheeled by me, even as if the earth had rolled with invisible motion her diurnal round. Behind me they did stretch in solemn train, feebler and feebler, and I stood and watched till all was tranquil as a dreamless sleep. He builds a stunning sense of atmosphere and awe of the Lake District, so I really enjoyed the juxtaposition of that against the grimy streets of Oliver Twist and the kind of marshy lands that Oliver goes out into when he even is in the countryside. My voice is getting tired, it's almost as though I've been talking for an hour. Still in 1847, Jane Eyre was published, shortly followed by Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights by Charlotte, Anne and Emily Bronte respectively. While I didn't read Jane Eyre this year, I think I must have read it at least 6 times, so it was time for pastures new. I did watch this film version, which to me is no more than a shadow of the original story. I would love to talk more about Jane Eyre on this channel at some point, but not yet. I need to organise my thoughts. One thing that I did particularly want to talk about, that I have definitely been thinking about this month, was the part in Lowood School and the way in which the children there are given, in terms of food and clothing, really the bare minimum of the bare minimum, in a way that makes them very vulnerable to death, which ties in very well with Oliver Twist. In Jane Eyre, the school is eventually hit by typhoid, leading to distinct improvements in the way that it is run. Typhoid was just one of the many diseases that the Victorians were up against due to poor hygiene and sanitation. Another was cholera, which swelled into an epidemic by 1848, part of the global third cholera pandemic. In London, 14,137 people are recorded as having died of cholera, and people started to notice a weird association between streets with worse sanitation issues and streets with the highest mortality. In Leeds, a man called Angus Reach told the Morning Chronicle how such streets would be ankle-deep in muck, with pigs wandering freely through the courts, a vivid reminder of just how different town life was for the Victorians. Like the typhoid at Lowood, cholera led to changes in the sewage systems. However, unfortunately, public health professionals like Edwin Chadwick thought at the time that cholera spread through a miasma, so they prioritised getting rid of bad smells by directing sewage into the River Thames, London's main source of drinking water. Well, they couldn't get everything right. Also in 1848, the Chartists brought yet another petition for voting rights to Parliament, and yet again they were rejected. It was a time of revolution in other parts of Europe, and the establishment was a bit tetchy. But otherwise, progress was continuing, with the London and North Western Railway reducing journey times between Leeds and London from days to hours, really starting to make the country feel a lot more connected and really boosting industries that required trade between cities. In art, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was established. They favoured medieval scenes and a close faith to nature over some of the more classical approaches to art that we have been seeing up to now. Unfortunately, to me, they weren't very good at it, so be on the lookout for some truly appalling pictures coming up from them shortly. By 1849, the cholera epidemic was abating somewhat, as was the Irish potato famine. In this year, Charlotte Bronte's second full-length book, Shirley, was published. By this time, Branwell, Emily and Anne Bronte had all died of tuberculosis within the space of a year. Shirley is set a lot earlier on in the 19th century, but its examination of the social problems linked to industrialisation feels very relevant to the Victorian era. For this year, I read a short poem by Matthew Arnold called Shakespeare, in which he looks up to Shakespeare, and I can't even remember what he really says in this poem. Always helps if you know what it says before you talk about it. In which he basically hero worships Shakespeare. By Victorian times, Shakespeare had really been elevated to the status of a national poet that couldn't really be questioned in his greatness, in something that my old English teacher referred to as bardolatry. Arnold's praise of Shakespeare as a self-taught man is quite relevant from a man who was himself an inspector of schools. Now we get to 1850, halfway through the 19th century, and this is considered to be the start of the golden years of the Victorian era by some historians. In this year, Catholic bishops returned to England due in part to the numbers of Irish Catholic people who had arrived during the potato famine. While this upset many people at the time, we are starting to see a society in which multiple religious doctrines are able to coexist in the public space. In what would have been very good news for many working people, Saturday was made into a half day, so all of a sudden people had a noticeable amount of free time. They had a weekend, effectively. And towns began to respond to that by supporting the creation of public parks and so on. Equally, the Public Libraries Act allowed towns to fund public libraries as opposed to private subscription libraries, massively increasing the average person's access to books. This was the year that William Wordsworth passed away, and Alfred Lord Tennyson took over as Poet Laureate. Now, Tennyson is really the creme de la creme of poet laureates. He had already written many popular poems, but some of the poems that he wrote as Poet Laureate were immensely popular and influential, and we will come back to those later on. For this year, because I didn't have much reading material from the 1850s, I read an early work by Lewis Carroll, and I've just realised that I'm using the Lewis Carroll book to kind of prop up my laptop, which is what I'm reading my notes from. I will try and fish it out without causing a catastrophe. Called The Walking Stick of Destiny. My copy of the collected works of Lewis Carroll used to belong to my mother, and it is so old and decrepit that I'm almost scared to pick it up. But basically, The Walking Stick of Destiny is a completely absurd short story about some barons and a magician and a poet and a walking stick. My experience of reading this was quite similar to my experience of reading The Duke of Zamorna, in that it felt like it must be part of a wider tale that I don't have the whole of, making it very hard to follow. I'm not sure whether it is or not, because I couldn't really find anything about this story online, but that was my sort of impression that I got. But it was very diverting and definitely very Lewis Carroll-esque, because really, who else would feature the line, "August potato, I obey your potent voice," with perfect solemnity. So I'm glad I had a little taster of that. In 1851, there was the Great Exhibition in London, in the Crystal Palace that had been set up in Hyde Park. And this was kind of like the event of the year. It was organised in part by Prince Albert, and many of our favourite authors and public figures dropped by, including Lewis Carroll and Tennyson, who I've just been talking about, but also Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, William Makepeace Thackeray, Charles Darwin, and Mary Ann Evans, who was later to become George Eliot, who was at that time just beginning to work as an assistant editor of the Westminster Review. There were 13,000 exhibits of everything from diamonds to fax machines, and very excitingly, there were even public toilets that you could spend a penny to use, a term which has become a popular idiom. If you have watched the BBC miniseries adaptation of North and South, they make the characters go there in a slightly unnecessary deviation from the plot, in my eyes, but it does provide some contemporary setting, I suppose. It's been a while since we had any art, so here, as I promised you, is a work by one of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, someone called John Everett Millais. Actually, to my mind, it's one of the better pre-Raphaelite paintings out there, and the whole setup of it really reflects this taste they were cultivating for the Gothic and the medieval. This painting is called Mariana, and it's based on a poem by Tennyson from 1830, which is itself based on Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. So in it we can really see this very Victorian trick of reworking old stories to fit new times, and harping back to the old when so much around them is new, and creating visual media that reflects the works of literature that are important to them. In 1852, Charles Dickens was still going strong, and this was the year that Bleak House came out. It was also the year that a man called Samuel Fox decided to put whalebone supports instead of wood or metal into umbrellas, making them an easily portable item. Now I bet that was not the kind of fact that you were expecting to hear from this. This was actually brilliant news for a lot of women who were neither wealthy enough to never have to go out in the rain, nor normal enough to go out in the rain all the time and just deal with it. Now, if Mariana has left you thinking that I was too harsh on the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, just take a look at this painting by W.H. Hunt from 1853, which is just a purely sickening vision of Victorian morality and Victorian interior design. The young girl is playing the piano to her lover when she suddenly realises that she is being very naughty indeed. Somehow the art book chose this as the best example of W.H. Hunt's work, which to me is pretty damning. Not all art from this year was dreadful though, and I do rather like this one by John Martin. I find it quite awe-inspiring. It speaks of great conflict. And in 1853, the Pax Britannica that I mentioned previously was marred by the start of the Crimean War. Basically, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, and it was a bit unclear who was coming in to fill the breach. Russia fancied getting to be top dog, but Britain and France were significantly less keen on that idea. The Crimean War was really quite important as wars go, because due to modern technology, newspapers were able to send correspondents to the front line, who could then submit reports by telegraph to be published almost immediately, really creating this idea of war journalism. Reports of the grim conditions faced by injured soldiers led to women like Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole travelling to the Crimea to throw their efforts into caring for these men in 1854. Once there, Nightingale became simultaneously both this angelic vision of the caring Lady of the Lamp, an image itself developed by the Times newspaper, which by this time was selling 50,000 copies per day, and also a critical statistician who was able to deduce patterns in the mortality rates of her patients and develop logical solutions. The Crimean War was the scene of one of British military history's most notorious defeats, the infamous Charge of the Light Brigade, in which over 600 cavalrymen were accidentally sent headfirst into the artillery, and less than 200 came back unscathed. The event was reported in the Times by somebody who used the phrase, "someone has blundered." It was read by Tennyson, and one of his best-known poems was then created, allegedly in just a couple of minutes. This picture I'm showing here, which might be the only painting I've had so far by a female artist, actually wasn't painted until 1881, and it's supposed to be of an earlier battle, the Battle of Waterloo. But ever since I first saw it, which must be several years ago by now, it has always been associated for me with the chaos and the drama of the Charge of the Light Brigade. So I thought I would show it here while I talk a little bit about this poem, because it's my video and I will put the pictures that I want to put. I was thinking of reading a couple of stanzas aloud for you, but I honestly couldn't choose which, and I found them all quite hard to read out. Tennyson himself was actually recorded reading this poem onto a wax cylinder, and you can find that on YouTube, but it is honestly next to impossible to hear what he says, and you can only really tell that his reading of it seems quite odd. So all I can recommend is that you read it for yourself, because it is both very short and very absorbing. And Tennyson really pulls off the great British trick of turning a catastrophic defeat into some kind of heroic marvel, with the soldiers willingly and valiantly throwing themselves into this bloodbath because somehow it seems like the righteous thing to do. I think something like the Charge of the Light Brigade is really echoed in all great war scenes where people expect things to go wrong but fight anyway. This idea of for death or glory, it really fits into this wider heroic tradition, going backwards to something like the Iliad and forwards to like 4th Eolingas in Lord of the Rings, to the point that it is almost hard to think of it as a real event, and these are real people who fell victim to a bungled message, and you know, they're not actually on their way to Valhalla. A less inspiring poem that was also written in 1854 was The Angel of the House by Coventry Patmore, which wasn't all that popular at the time, apparently, but its title has become a common shorthand for describing the position and expectations of women at the time. In 1855, the Daily Telegraph was founded, and existing newspapers like the Manchester Guardian were enabled to flourish thanks to slight changes in the law, as well as increasing literacy in the general population. In the literary sphere, Charlotte Bronte passed away and her close friend Elizabeth Gaskell began working on her biography. At this time, Gaskell's own perhaps best known novel, North and South, was being serialised in Household Words, edited by Charles Dickens, who apparently was involved in choosing the title North and South. North and South is another Victorian novel that I have read repeatedly, even though it is really the Victorian version of a cheesy romance, because it is also just so interesting. Gaskell really delves into a lot of different themes that are very topically Victorian, from rural and urban poverty to the Factory Acts that we've been talking about, to changes in religious thought, to even a bit of the Navy, as well as themes that are more enduring, like the role of authority and the power of man over man in maintaining a stable society. I'm holding the BBC miniseries because I don't have the book here, and this is quite a lovely adaptation that I think I'm now going to have to rewatch. The first of the Barsetshire Chronicles by Anthony Trollope also came out this year, though I haven't read any of those yet. In 1856, the Crimean War finally ended, but it wasn't all peace and light, because the Second Opium War began the same year as well. This was also the year that Thomas Hardy, who was then just the 16-year-old son of a builder, watched the public execution of a woman who had murdered her husband, an event which is thought to have influenced his later writing. And that brings us to the end of the second decade of Queen Victoria's rule. By this time, crinoline size had exploded, and a well-to-do young lady might be sporting a dress like this discreet, restrained, elegant and affordable promenade dress, now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Again, like I said before, this is a very patchy history by a non-historian, and I purely wanted to do this in order to put the books that I've read in Victober into some kind of context and embed them for myself in the Victorian world that they grew out of. I have found this project fascinating so far. I've probably read less than I could have done because of it, but I think that I've understood what I am reading more, which has got to be a bonus. So for the second decade of the Victorian era, I really just read, I think, bits of about 4 poems, and I did read The Walking Stick of Destiny as a short story by Lewis Carroll. But previously I've read quite a few things from this decade, so I'm not feeling like I've missed too much there. Once again, I would love it if you would put in the comments your thoughts and views and any other events that you know of, and also talk to me about the books that you've read from this decade as well. And talk about anything that you found particularly interesting about this decade, or anything that you've seen that you think still has like a hangover to modern life. I would love to hear that. So again, thank you very much for watching, happy reading, and I will speak to you soon. Bye!